Gold Mafia documentary part one has been quite explosive to say the least. Um, as an accountant, South African business entrepreneur, I feel that I would like to share with you guys my thoughts on the documentary. I'd like to share how Africans should actually be looking at this documentary and also just give a breakdown of sort of what is the picture being painted, and really to give some takeaways that I feel that the world needs to know, and more importantly for Africans that need to know so that they can use it to their opportunity as we develop. Because in a majority sort of perspective, or the majority of the world looks at Africa as a developing country, a rural country, a country that really is waiting to be rescued. And I feel this documentary can be a tool to conscientize Africans to realizing the truth of how they are placed in the world, how they are viewed, and what they should do in order to rise up and actually become who they really are. So yeah, that's a little bit poetic, but yeah, let's have a look at this Al Jazeera documentary. I'd like to break it down to explain certain concepts of which explain the basic narrative of what's being exposed, to show who are the villains and who are supposedly the good guys. But mind you, this is part one out of a four-part documentary. We don't know what else is going to come, and I look forward to seeing it because I think this was a very good documentary that helps to tell an African story, and I think it's about time. And let's get to it. The Al Jazeera documentary covers the illicit gold trading that is happening in Zimbabwe, and really what everything is being encompassed in this documentary is just showing how you could say corruption in terms of government's point of view or interest on how they are using gold smuggling in order to inform and enrich their economy, as Zimbabwe is under severe and catastrophic hyperinflation, which has rendered their currency useless, and therefore they have to find ways as a country to survive and basically to rise up upon the challenges that they've been through for the past 20 years and more. Now, the documentary shows some characters. There's a Kenyan-born business person that is, well, I could say an agent more than anything, who did some work in Kenya and ultimately moves to Zimbabwe after being ousted at Kenya. More on that later. And when he's in Zimbabwe, the same thing that he did for the Kenyan government, he is being he's using his set of skills to help Zimbabwe, because as we know, Zimbabwe is under sanctions. And sanctions, I think, is really the foundation of what's happening, because at the end of the day, his solution to help the Zimbabwean government is relatively to smuggle gold. Why specific gold? I'm going to explain that. I think it's very important for us to understand that sanctions, gold, and economic activity are the key words that we need to break down further in order to understand what's actually going on, who are the bad guys and who are the guys that are being taken advantage of. So I think that's a good basis to cover the documentary. I also believe, just to give a summary, the documentary is in two parts. I think the first part explains how Zimbabwe is, or it explains the characters, the people that are involved, the role players, how Zimbabwe is in a situation that these role players are able to operate in the way that they're operating in order to allow certain outcomes. And these outcomes, it's illegal of nature. Why illegal? Because it comes down to the point where Zimbabwe is actually being exploited. And I feel like that's the first part of the documentary, even though the trailers and all the snippets will make you believe to show that Zimbabwe is this lawless outlaw of a country whereby everybody does what they want. Government, is just looting, and ministers are just there to be disposed by influential people. So I think it does a good sort of job of showing how Zimbabwe is actually being exploited. And then on the second part of the documentary, it goes to show the illegal element of what's actually happening. So even though they don't properly articulate which parts are illegal and which parts are not, I'm just breaking it down to you guys that the first part just really shows the mechanisms of what's actually happening. And in terms of what's happening, looking at gold smuggling and how it's done, why it's called gold smuggling, it's a term that's been used, but effectively what they're doing is they are extracting gold from their own country and they are putting it into the market via Dubai, and they're getting money which they can't use the Zim dollar, so they're using the US dollar because that is the globally dominated currency. So let's begin with sanctions. What are sanctions? I feel like every Zimbabwean, or if you know a Zimbabwean, they always tell you that they're under sanctions, and this thing is really hampering their quality of life, their ability to generate an income, and henceforth they go to other countries where they look for economic green pastures, and it's all due to sanctions. Now let's define the word sanctions. What are sanctions? Now, according to ChatGPT, sanctions are a form of punitive action taken by countries or international organizations to put pressure on another country or entity to change its behavior. Sanctions can take many forms, including economic sanctions, travel bans, and asset freezes. Now, in the context of Zimbabwe, they basically have all these sanctions implemented upon them. Now, as the definition says, is to change their country's behavior. What type of behavior was Zimbabwe doing that has put them in this situation? Obviously, we know based on how Zimbabwe has obtained its political freedom, there have been certain things that have been happening, and the main argument is all about human rights violations and those sort of things under the former president Robert Mugabe. Now, the funny thing about that is, in 2023, Robert Mugabe has passed on, and nothing has relatively changed. However, a lot of resilient people within Zimbabwe are starting to explore ways around the economic sanctions or the general overreaching sanctions. And these sanctions really have created a situation where Zimbabweans have to be creative. And once again, I hope you can start seeing that this is one of those nuggets that's showing you that this documentary is just showing what these people are doing to get their way around the sanctions. Zimbabwe has been subjected to various sanctions by different countries and international organizations. The sanctions were imposed in response to human rights abuses, political repression, and corruption under the regime of former President Robert Mugabe, who was in power from 1987 to 2017. The United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom are among the countries and organizations that have imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe. The sanctions include travel bans and asset freezes on individuals and entities accused of human rights abuses and corruption. The EU sanctions, which were first imposed in 2002, targeted individuals and entities responsible for the undermining democracy and human rights in Zimbabwe. The sanctions were later expanded to include an arms embargo and a ban on provision of military and police training. The United States first imposed targeted sanctions on Zimbabwe in 2003, including travel bans and asset freezes on individuals and entities involved in human rights abuses and corruption. The sanctions were expanded in 2008 to include additional individuals and entities. And in 2019, the US government imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe's state security minister for his alleged involvement in human rights abuses. The sanctions have had a significant impact on Zimbabwe's economy, making it difficult for the country to access international markets and investment. The Zimbabwean government has criticized the sanctions, arguing that they are unjustified and have hurt ordinary Zimbabweans. Now, this raises an ethical issue around sanctions, of which it is a global debate that whether are actually sanctions ethical, because at the end of the day, sanctions is not to say that you've actually broken the law. It's more of like you have done something that another country deems incorrect, and often those other countries are countries that are more powerful and have sort of abilities to overthrow a particular country or entity, but they can't do that because that will be a greater unethical thing to do. And because most countries have their own sovereignty, unless they're colonized, then sanctions are implied. Now, the unethicalness of sanctions is when they go overboard, because now they start infringing the very same human rights or human rights abuses on the citizens, the ordinary citizens of that particular country. And that's exactly what's happening in Zimbabwe. And what this is doing, it's more of like a situation whereby a country that's living in privilege is inflicting the all types of hurt on another country because they're not there, they don't care, and the people that are living around that country are the one in and around that country are the ones that experience the results of that abuse. And therefore, to what end does sanctions actually go, to the extent of which, they just keep on hurting another country or a country? So at the end of the day, what's happening in Zimbabwe is quite gross in terms of the violations that are happening. And unfortunately, because certain countries and their powers are using their influence and their ability or their position in the world to put pressure on a country that is trying to find itself. Obviously, under new leadership, Emerson Mnangagwa, sorry, he is obviously trying to take a broken country and take it somewhere. Now, the question is, how can they do that? And this leads me to the gold smuggling, as it's been called. Remember now, the funny thing about this, it's called gold smuggling because of these sanctions and all sorts of things that have put Zimbabwe in a place where they cannot do anything. They've literally been left there to suffer. And at the end of the day, it's creating a barbaric situation where people are dying of hunger and they can't sit around and do nothing. There has to be something. And with globalization and the world becoming smaller due to the internet and all sorts of developments in technology, Zimbabweans are seeing the world, and people are traveling, people are experiencing the world, and they want a piece of the pie just like everybody else. Gold smuggling is a major problem in Zimbabwe, where small-scale gold miners produce around 60% of the country's gold output, which they often sell on the black market to avoid taxes and regulations. Here are some common ways in which gold is smuggled in Zimbabwe. Now, before we get into gold smuggling and the use of gold, we need to understand why gold. Out of all the precious metals and mineral resources available in Africa, obviously there's plenty of them, but gold, in terms of the global view, is a very special metal. Now, why is it special? Is because, you see, obviously we have a finite amount of gold around the world, and certain countries and territories have more gold than others. And in terms of that type of situation, the beautiful thing about gold versus, let's say, diamonds or any other precious metal is gold can be renewed all the time. So long as gold is purified, it can become anything. It never it's a store of value because it doesn't change. What gold is, gold remains as is. And if gold has been sort of like I'm looking for a word. If gold has been sort of it's what's the opposite of purified? Impurified? I don't know. If gold is contaminated, what can be done is it can be refined, and when it's refined, all the impurities are extracted, and pure gold is obtained, and that can be turned into whatever it needs to be turned in, usually gold bars, and that's how it's traded via the value chain of the smuggling. Now, that being said, or what I'm trying to say that you should be realizing about gold is that gold, the same gold that you could be potentially wearing right now, could easily be the same gold that was in ancient Egypt times and anywhere else. So in other words, gold has this perpetual life whereby if it's used for something else, once it's refined, it can be used for something else, and therefore it's untraceable. You cannot, like a diamond, right? If you cut a diamond and actually sort of refine it the way it's been refined, how diamond cutters are very important in the process or the value chain of how diamond is valued. The minute that diamond is worked on by somebody that is that doesn't have the proper skills, that diamond can be broken, and once it's broken, it immediately loses its value. Whereas with gold, if you have the right tools to refine it and obtain its purity, then that gold holds its value in gold in terms of its weight. So a certain kilo or a weight of gold equals a certain price, and it's as simple as that. So gold is, you're able to refine it and you can sell it anywhere because it's untraceable. You cannot trace where gold comes from. You can suspect based on where you're buying it from, but wherever you get gold from, the minute it's refined, whoever that refines it, they can add their stamp of authority. But once it goes to another territory, in other words, from Zimbabwe to Dubai will refine it, and where its origin will be effectively erased if they deem to want to do that. So that's the thing about gold smuggling. Wherever gold is, it's literally can be used anywhere. It can be from anywhere, and it often is just from anywhere. You can't trace where gold comes from, except if there is records that have properly documented its history, and therefore that's why the international organizations that have been set up are trying to do exactly that. They're trying to make gold illegal if you don't have a license, because if you have a license, you can be properly identified as a buyer and seller, and as you buy and sell, then the origin of that gold can be determined. Now, that's why gold is such a good commodity to actually be involved in this type of setup or financial deal, because gold you can effectively erase its history, where it comes from, and that's the reason why gold smuggling exists. Now, at this point, Zimbabwe is dealing with your Dubai, and another thing that we need to be learning out of this is Dubai is obviously known for its oil, and once they've understood their position and so forth with the influence of oil, they have developed with other countries that are big oil producers. They say it's called the cartel, OPEC, and OPEC is there to help these people to trade the resources that they have. And I feel like as Africans, we need to understand that we are the bearers of the most gold. Why aren't we having an organization that is putting us as the center of gold trade? And the minute we start doing things like that, that's where we take the power away from the countries that are bullying financially or economically or via sanctions, bullying other countries. And I say this because countries like the US do exactly that. When you look at the evolution of money used to be based on gold, in other words, the gold standard. And when the US saw that this gold standard is going to be a problem for them, they effectively change their financial system in order to adopt fiat currency, whereby now they are basing currency, their money, based on what their central banks will determine money is. And they had to find some sort of backing in terms of to move how the dollar is being demanded. In other words, you want to create demand for the dollar because gold was the demand. Now you're moving your demand into other commodities, particularly oil, and that's why a lot of wars and things were fought. And this is just really giving you an outlook on how these geopolitical tactics work, because these countries, they predict the future and they look at how they can manage other countries to prevent them from effectively dethroning them. So it's all that they do, it's all in their interest. So once again, I go back to the question of the ethicalness of sanctions. You look at this documentary, many people are saying a lot of things, because at the end of the day, what is the purpose of this? Obviously, we'll see as the remaining parts of this documentary are presented, and I will definitely be breaking it down for you guys. And look out for that. Subscribe to the channel, like and share the video. Really would appreciate that. So that's really how countries like the US move. Their objective is to maintain power. And for Africans, if we do not find ways to actually harness the power that we have, the raw power that we have, other people will tell us what to do with the power that we have. And that's effectively what's happening with Zimbabwe. And I feel that fortunately, as a South African, I can see Zimbabwe is getting to a point whereby they are able to economically push themselves. There is an economic boom, there's a property boom, there's a lot of things happening in Zimbabwe by virtue of them using the US dollar. There are attempts from the Zimbabwean government to resuscitate the Zim dollar and have it back trading, because at the end of the day, them using US dollars, it's a bit of a quagmire situation. But once again, the origin of the dollars and everything, so long as it's pumped to the country, it's fair game, and they are finding ways around it. And the sanctions are being challenged, and that's why Zimbabwe now is giving a global cry or global push, whereby they are going through the channels of the EU by virtue of showing that, guys, we have sorted our human rights situation. We as Zimbabwe are committed to a new Zimbabwe, reform Zimbabwe, and therefore we should have these sanctions demolished. And slowly but surely, that seems to be what's happening. So yeah, guys, I think I've said quite enough for part 1 of this video. I look forward to seeing the remaining parts, and I hope I've offered you guys some value into how to look at this documentary and giving an alternative perspective based on that documentary. So thanks for watching, guys. Please remember to subscribe, and please like and share.